Superman, Batman, the original Captain Marvel. During the golden age of comics, only the best and most popular characters could be the lead in multiple titles. Many of these characters are still with us today, but a few have become lost heroes of the golden age. This is the story of one lost hero, the Black Terror. From the comic book racks, the Black Terror waged a battlefront all his own against the Axis. His first victory was in Exciting Comics, where he began as a lead feature. From there, he moved on to his own title, and after that, he branched out and became the main attraction of America's best comics. Only a very elite group of characters could carry off this many titles month after month after month, but the Black Terror did this for an amazing 7-year run. When you look at the Black Terror and his mythos, it's pretty much standard superhero fare. The Black Terror's alter ego is a pharmacist named Bob Benton. Local gangsters are shaking down his drugstore for protection money, and as they're leaving, the gangsters beat up a street orphan named Tim. Bob helps the injured Tim into the back room of his drugstore, and the action really takes off when Tim accidentally mixes chemicals into one of Benton's experiments. The accident turns into a miracle. Benton drinks the mixture and suddenly he has super strength. Next, Benton decides to put an end to the shakedown racket. He puts on a black costume and hits the streets as the Black Terror. After he leaves, Tim tries the formula and becomes equally strong. He happens to have an identical costume, and he follows Benton on his crusade as Kid Terror. As Batman and Robin were the dynamic duo, the Black Terror and Kid Terror would go on to fight crime as the Terror Twins. The story of the Black Terror is not all that different from 100 other superheroes from this time period. So the question is, why did the Black Terror become so popular? Well, it's pretty simple. The costume. Nope, just kidding. Although you have to admit, it is a snazzy, eye-catching costume. But the real reason the Black Terror was so popular was due to the high caliber of creators producing his stories. First, the publisher was Ned Pines. You might remember him from my Black Bat video. He began his publishing empire when he was a teenager, printing a newspaper for his Boy Scout troop. While attending Columbia University, he published his first pulp magazine, and from there, he built a number of publishing lines of pulp magazines and comic books. His pulp heroes included the Phantom Detective and the Black Bat. His comic line featured an equally explosive lineup of superheroes, including the Fighting Yank, Doc Strange, and Miss Mask. The creators of the Black Terror were artist Dave Gabrielson and writer Richard Hughes. Both were employees of the Benjamin Sanger studio. Sanger was an independent packager of comics, and comic publishers would come to him for characters and stories. His studio produced comics for a number of publishers, including DC and Quality. In addition to writing, Hughes was also an editor. He would create and develop a number of Pine's early superheroes, including the Fighting Yank and Doc Strange. And as the line expanded, more and more people had to be brought in to handle it. Some worked from independent studios, others were freelancers, and some worked directly for Pines. Writer Edmund Hamilton was a freelancer. He was a renowned science fiction writer in the 1920s and 30s. He made a name for himself writing for pulps like Weird Tales and Amazing Stories. In comics, Hamilton worked primarily for DC, where he wrote Superman, Batman, and the Green Lantern. Hamilton's genre of choice, of course, was science fiction, but his Black Terror stories followed tropes and formulas that were very popular in menace pulps in the 1930s. Usually his villain is some sort of mad scientist or mystery person who is threatening some innocent, a young woman, an older gentleman, or perhaps an orphan. Often there is some sort of torture gimmick that creates cliffhanger moments. Another writer that needs to be mentioned got hired by answering a want ad. After being turned down by Harper's, Vogue, Good Housekeeping, Time Magazine, and The New Yorker, Patricia Highsmith found herself wandering into Pine's offices. She was hired as a bullpen writer for $55 a week. As a bullpen writer, she was expected to crank out 2 stories a day. Highsmith worked in the bullpen for about a year. and during that time she worked on her writing craft. She had a unique gift for creating highly developed characters with realistic motivations. She also had the ability to create a lot of suspense and tension in her stories. Those skills separated her from the majority of her peers who focused on action-driven stories. With comic book professionals being called up for military service, she realized that the comic book industry was wide open to her, and she began shopping her skills. She found freelance work at DC, Fawcett, and Timely. She then quit the bullpen and became a full-time freelancer. And by becoming a freelancer, Highsmith made considerably more money, and it gave her the opportunity to travel. And she spent the next several years freelancing in comics and traveling the country. Several accounts have it that Timely editor Vince Faygo had a crush on her. He decided that he could not pursue a relationship because he was married, but he could fix her up with someone he knew, someone who was a little closer to her age. In fact, he tried to hook her up with another editor at Timely, a guy named Stan Lee. No one but them know the details of their blind date, but years later, Stan Lee said it was a disaster. In the same interview, he also called her a horrible person. Highsmith's reputation is that she was a very abrasive person. As a writer, she was a keen observer of the human condition. She loved to push people's buttons and see how they reacted. Creating situations and arguing with people opened a doorway for her to see into people's minds. She then used these reactions for the characters in her stories. From the very beginning, her aspirations were not to stay in comics. They were of a much higher literary nature. By the late 1940s, she's running around in the circles of Truman Capote and Allen Ginsberg. This was at a time even before these guys became famous writers themselves. In fact, Highsmith was one of the first of this circle to break out in 1950 when her first novel was published. It was called Strangers on a Train, and within months after its release, director Alfred Hitchcock secretly bought the film rights through a third party, and within a year, the film version hit the theaters. Both the novel and film were huge critical and commercial successes. She followed up Strangers on a Train with the first critically acclaimed LGBT novel, The Price of Salt, which she published under the pen name of Claire Morgan. She would go on to write over 20 novels and win prestigious fiction writing awards such as the Edgar Allan Poe Award and the O. Henry Award. So, you might be asking yourself, why is one of the best comic book writers of the Golden Age not widely heralded in comic fandom? Especially in today's environment with her groundbreaking success as a woman in comics, her many literary achievements, success in Hollywood, and LGBT street cred. Well, there's a number of reasons for this. First, she never wanted to be in comics. From the very start, she never allowed her name to appear in a comic book. Her stories go uncredited, and she did this on purpose. She felt that comics were beneath her. She didn't want her name tied to comics because she feared that she would be labeled as a comic book writer. She also did this with her book The Price of Salt. She didn't want to be labeled as a lesbian writer. There's no doubt that comics helped her develop her writing skills, but later in life, even with all of her success, she denied ever writing comics. Another reason she goes unheralded is that in real life she was a very callous and unlikable person. And from the stories I've read, she could put the charm on if she needed something from you, but if you couldn't do anything for her, she was as cold as ice, or dismissive, or even worse, she could be quite toxic. The final reason, and probably the main reason, she gets swept into the dustbin of history is that she was an unapologetic bigot and racist. She's on record saying horrible things about black people, and these comments only pale in comparison with her comments about Asians. For these sins, the literary world and comic fandom just sort of kind of wants to forget her. As for her Black Terror stories, if you peruse through the issues available in online archives, there are a number of uncredited stories that leap out. Her vocabulary is much wider than that of her peers. Her stories have a sharper, snappier, and wittier dialogue. Her plots are full of suspense and tension. Her characters, even the throwaway characters, have depth. Another tip-off is that Highsmith enjoyed traveling. And oddly enough, so does the Black Terror. Several stories are set in Mexico or the American Southwest, which is the area she grew up in. Other stories take place in New Orleans or the West Coast. These stories appear to be written by someone with a certain degree of knowledge of these locations. The writing in Black Terror was superior to most comics of the day, but then so was the artwork. First, the cover artwork was generally done by the incredible Alex Schomburg. In the 1920s, he moved from Puerto Rico to New York City, and with his brothers he formed an art studio that focused on advertising art. And in the 1930s, Schomburg broke away from his brothers and began doing cover art for pulp magazines. Schomburg became an expert airbrush artist, and today his covers are considered masterpieces. Interesting thing I noticed when I was looking over his covers is that there is a slight difference between his Timely covers and his Pines Publishing covers. I'm not sure if this was his decision or that of editorial. The layouts are slightly different, and so are the color palettes. If you went to a comic book rack in the early 1940s, both companies would have their own distinct look. For the Black Terror, Schomburg's covers have an Art Deco influence. I think that he drew inspiration for this style from newspaper strips that were published in the 1920s and 30s. Stan Lee felt that Schomburg was the greatest cover artist of the Golden Age and often compared his work with that of Norman Rockwell. Great artwork appeared on the Black Terror's interior pages as well. DC artists Jerry Robinson and Mort Meskin had left DC to start up their own studio. Jerry Robinson began his career as Bob Kane's assistant on Batman. He co-created much of the Dark Knight's mythos such as the Joker, Robin the Boy Wonder, and Alfred the Butler. While at DC, he met fellow artist Mort Meskin. Meskin worked on characters like the Vigilante, Wildcat, Johnny Quick, and Starman. Black Terror publisher Ned Pines had strong connections to DC Comics, and when he found out that Robinson and Meskin were available, he hired them to draw the Black Terror. When they couldn't keep up with the workload, they brought in other DC artists like George Roussos. One thing that made this group of DC artists so good was that they were all enamored with the Orson Welles film Citizen Kane. They bragged to each other about how many times they'd seen the film, and they watched the movie over and over and over again, picking out storytelling techniques which they then applied to the stories they drew. One final thing that made the Black Terror popular was hidden in the stories. Several stories appear to have a subtle subversion that takes the form of humor or sexual innuendo. Sometimes drawings appeared rude. Other times dialogue would have a double meaning. In the 1960s, collectors began a treasure hunt looking for these little bits of naughtiness. This led to a rediscovery of the Black Terror and made him popular with Golden Age collectors. The superhero wave of the Golden Age came to an end in 1944. But thanks to the great stories and great artwork, the Black Terror remained in print, but his popularity began to slide. Superhero sales continued to plummet in the following years, and bit by bit, the Black Terror began to disappear from the comic racks. He was replaced in Exciting Comics, he took a backseat in America's Best Comics, and the Black Terror's run came to a complete stop in 1949. Like all of Pine's superheroes, he fell into public domain, and new publishers have picked him up. The best known revival is probably the Project Superpowers revival done by Dynamite Entertainment. Hi everyone, this is Darren, and I just want to say thank you for watching. Please help me out by hitting the like button and subscribing to my channel. By the way, a new Black Terror series came out by Dynamite just before the comic book shops closed down in the quarantine and all that stuff. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard little bits and pieces, some good, some bad, and I'm curious to find out more, so let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Also, my computer is dying. It's over 10 years old. It's starting to crash all the time. Please help me out by donating to my new computer fund at my Patreon account or by donating with a one-time PayPal gift. The links are in the description box down below. Every nickel is appreciated. Well, that's about it for me. I hope you have a great day. I hope you and your family are doing well and staying safe, and bye.